Before reason had a name, before medicine had courage, there was fear. Fear of what stirred behind the eyes, the flicker of thought that could betray heaven itself. The Middle Ages did not study the mind. They survived it. Madness was not a condition. It was a visitation, an unseen storm sent by God or the devil, a punishment or a test. When a man screamed at shadows, he was not ill, he was possessed. When a woman heard voices, she was not unwell, she was cursed. The church bells tolled for their souls, not their recovery. In villages lit by candles and dread, people whispered that the human mind was a door best left closed. To open it was to invite chaos, to hear what angels and demons murmured when the world slept. Priests stood where physicians would later stand. They spoke prayers instead of prescriptions, wielded crosses instead of cures. The afflicted were led to chapels, not clinics. There, their madness echoed off stone walls until it sounded like confession. Some were bound in silence, others were drowned in psalms. Monasteries became sanctuaries for the mad, or prisons. Behind their thick walls, monks recorded strange cases. The man who believed he was made of glass, the woman who claimed her dreams were messages from hell, the child who spoke in voices not his own. Each account was written as evidence of sin, never of sickness. To be mad was to stand on the edge of salvation and damnation. The body was mortal, but the mind belonged to eternity. Physicians, where they existed, dared not contradict theology. They spoke in metaphors, humors and spirits, vapors and balance. If the soul was troubled, perhaps the blood was thick, or the bile corrupted. Yet such theories were fragile things, easily shattered by sermons. The church ruled the human interior, as it ruled the heavens, completely. The stars themselves were thought to dictate sanity. Astrologers charted the fates of the mad, claiming Saturn's cold influence or the moon's restless pull could unmoor the mind. Lunacy, born of Luna, the moon became a word for those whose thoughts wandered with its phases, and so the night sky watched silently over the broken, while the earth beneath them offered no refuge. In this world there was no distinction between the sacred and the sick. Madness blurred into mysticism. Saints saw visions that the church celebrated. Peasants saw visions that it condemned. One was revelation, the other heresy, and the line between them was as thin as breath. The mad became mirrors, reminders of what lurked within all men, the capacity to lose reason, to be overtaken by something unseen. To fear madness was to fear oneself. Villagers told stories of those who wandered into forests at dusk, their minds unbound, and returned speaking riddles or not at all. Some claimed to hear laughter in the wind, the laughter of those whom God had touched too harshly. And yet, beneath all that fear, curiosity flickered. A few dared to wonder, if demons could enter the mind, could they be expelled not with holy water but with understanding? Could madness be studied, not banished? Such thoughts were dangerous. To question the divine order was to step outside it, and those who did were watched closely, whispered about, sometimes accused of heresy themselves. In the dim candlelight of monasteries, early scholars copied texts from the Islamic world, works by Avicenna and Al-Razi that hinted at something unthinkable, that madness might come from the brain, not the soul. But such ideas were handled as if radioactive. They were read in secret, discussed in whispers, hidden beneath pages of scripture. For now, faith stood guard against inquiry. In towns and courts, madness was also theatre. Jesters, fools, and prophets danced on the edge of reason, both feared and indulged. The nobleman's fool was a man permitted to speak madness aloud, his absurdity tolerated as entertainment. Yet outside the palace, the same behavior could lead to exile or execution. Society defined madness not by what it was, but by where it appeared. A fool in silk was charming. A fool in rags was cursed. As the plague swept through Europe, terror deepened. The Black Death decimated not only bodies but certainties. Those who raved in the streets, those who saw omens in the dying sun, all were said to be touched by divine wrath. Physicians in beaked masks bled and purged, prayed and burned incense, seeking to purify both flesh and spirit. But no cure reached the mind. The medieval world had built its walls high against the unknown, yet cracks had begun to form. Within the monasteries, amidst chants and scripture, lay the seeds of heresy, the idea that the mind could be mapped like the stars, that madness was not mystery, but malady. Still, that dawn was centuries away. For now, the Middle Ages lived in twilight, where every strange thought was a warning, every cry a confession, every whisper of madness, a reminder that the soul itself could be lost. And in that darkness, the human mind remained the last forbidden frontier, vast, unknowable, and terrifying. But whispers were spreading. From Cordoba to Salerno, from Baghdad to Bologna, physicians began to question what priests had declared immutable. Could the mind, like the body, be healed? Could madness, that shadow in the skull, be understood rather than feared? Such questions were sparks, faint, fragile, but bright enough to be dangerous. Soon they would ignite a conflict between faith and reason that would redefine how humanity saw itself. Because to understand the mind was to touch the soul, and the Middle Ages were not ready to face what they might find there. The story of madness was only beginning. If this story stirred something in you, that haunting mix of fear, faith and fascination, then follow the light into the next chapter. Like, share, and subscribe to help bring these hidden histories to life. Comment below, do you think the Middle Ages truly feared madness, or did they fear what it revealed about themselves? Your thoughts might shape the next story we tell, because the mind even now remains humanity's most mysterious battlefield. The 13th century, an age where ink and blood mingled on the same parchment. Europe, weary of its shadows, began to stir. The Black Death had passed like a storm, and in its terrible silence afterward, a question began to echo: what is a human being, truly? For centuries, faith had ruled the body, as it ruled the soul. But now, whispers from distant lands carried a dangerous promise: knowledge. Scrolls crossed the Mediterranean, written by scholars who spoke of anatomy, medicine, and a strange word that made the clergy uneasy: reason. From the House of Wisdom in Baghdad to the universities of Salerno and Montpellier, ancient Greek texts, filtered through Arabic minds, returned to Europe, transformed. Hippocrates and Galen, reborn through Avicenna and Al-Razi, offered a new vision that the body was not merely clay for divine punishment, but a system, intricate, fragile, and astonishingly human. And yet, even as this light flickered, superstition clung to every shadow it cast. Physicians of the Middle Ages were men walking a tightrope between salvation and heresy. To heal the body was holy. To question the soul's dominion over the mind, unthinkable. Still, they asked if the heart could falter, could the brain, if a wound could fester in flesh, could thought itself become infected. In dim lecture halls that smelled of parchment and oil, young students leaned over preserved corpses, sheep, pigs, sometimes criminals, tracing the mysteries of flesh by candlelight. Every cut of the blade was an act of rebellion, every drop of blood an argument against the invisible. But the church watched. Dissection was forbidden in most lands. The human body was a sacred vessel, untouchable in death, as in life. Yet curiosity is not easily caged. Under the cover of night, scholars bribed grave diggers, stole the bodies of the executed, and performed their clandestine rituals in the flicker of torches. Some said they heard the whispers of the dead as they worked. Not ghosts, but the ancient voices of reason, murmuring truths that had been silenced for centuries. Within these hidden rooms, a revolution began. They discovered that the brain was not a formless mass, but an organ of astonishing complexity. Galen's theories, that the brain's ventricles were chambers of spirit, where thought was distilled like vapor, gained new weight. Others began to suspect the truth, that the brain was not merely the seat of reason, but the stage upon which madness played its cruel theater. Yet no one dared to speak it aloud. Physicians cloaked their ideas in allegory. They wrote of melancholy vapors, rising from the liver to cloud the soul, or phlegmatic humors, thickening the thoughts. To name the brain as the source of madness outright was to accuse creation itself of imperfection, and that, in the eyes of the church, was blasphemy. But the evidence was mounting. Men who suffered blows to the head, lost memory, reason, or speech. Others, tormented by invisible terrors, showed no marks upon their bodies, only a strange stillness behind their eyes. What if these wounds were not spiritual at all? What if they were hidden beneath the bone? In Italy, The surgeon Mondino de Liuzzi made history by conducting one of the first recorded human dissections in the early 1300s. His students gathered in stunned silence as he peeled back layers of the human form, revealing what scripture had never dared describe. He mapped muscles, veins, and organs with precision, but when he reached the head he hesitated. The skull was more than bone. It was the threshold of mystery. To open it was to trespass upon the soul's domain. Still he pressed forward. Within the skull's hollow, Mondino found no angels, no demons, only matter, pale, soft, fragile matter. And in that moment, a terrible beauty dawned. Perhaps the divine spark was not a spirit above flesh, but a secret hidden within it. He wrote of the brain's ventricles, of the cerebellum and the spinal cord. He did not yet understand their purpose, but he had seen them, and that alone was heretical enough. His work spread through Europe in whispered copies, smuggled between monasteries and universities. For every man who sought to learn, another sought to silence him. Doctors and theologians argued fiercely. Was madness the result of humoral imbalance or the devil's touch? Could herbs and surgery cure what prayers could not? The debate was not about science. It was about power. Who ruled the human mind? God or man? As the centuries turned, the balance began to shift. Alchemy, once a mystical art, started to birth chemistry. Astrology bled into astronomy, and within this alchemical crucible of faith and doubt, early psychiatry took its first trembling breath. Healers experimented with remedies: valerian, wormwood, opium. They bled their patients, purged them with herbs, starved or fed them, according to the alignment of planets. Every act was an attempt, desperate, fumbling, human, to find the bridge between the seen and the unseen. Yet even as these fragile sciences grew, the old fears deepened. Rumors spread that those who studied the brain risked their souls. One physician was said to have lost his sanity after touching the skull of a madman. Another died raving about the spirit trapped in the blood. Such stories were not forgotten. They were warnings, morality tales whispered by candlelight, to remind students that knowledge had teeth, but the pull of the unknown was stronger than fear. In secret notebooks, sketches of skulls appeared beside prayers for forgiveness. Notes on madness grew longer, more detailed, not accusations, but observations. The madman was becoming a patient, not a sinner. And yet, society was not ready. When the scholars' discoveries began to spread, the church struck back. Texts were banned. Anatomists were tried for heresy. Inquisitors burned books that dared to suggest the human soul might dwell in a fragile, fallible brain. Still, knowledge has a habit of surviving its own executioners. It hides in margins, in translations, in the memory of those who dare to dream. By the 15th century, the light of inquiry was burning brighter, too bright to extinguish. Dissection became more open, and with it, the mysteries of the human body unfolded in vivid detail. But understanding the body was only half the battle. The mind remained a labyrinth no scalpel could map. And so, as reason rose, fear adapted. If the mind could not be sanctified, it could at least be contained. Hospitals for the mad began to appear. Grand, echoing structures built not to heal, but to isolate. The age of curiosity was giving birth to the age of control. The physicians had opened the body. Next they would build walls around the mind. Because once you begin to understand madness, you must decide what to do with those who carry it. And that decision, that thin, trembling line between compassion and cruelty, would define the next chapter. The Renaissance promised light, but for the mad, it brought only walls. As Europe entered an age of discovery, art and science flourished. Yet reason had its victims. The mind, once feared as a haunted house, was now treated as a broken machine, and like all machines, it could be caged, repaired, or discarded. In the cities of the 15th and 16th centuries, the first great asylums rose, towering fortresses of charity and order. Paris had the Hôpital de Fuz, and soon after, Bethlehem Hospital in London, later called Bedlam. These were monuments not to understanding, but to control. Behind their gates, the mad were no longer seen as possessed, but neither were they seen as human. They were kept like curiosities, paraded as warnings of excess, sin, or divine disfavor. Society had found a new stage upon which to perform its fear. At first, these institutions were cloaked in piety. They called them houses of mercy, homes for the unfortunate. But mercy, in the hands of ignorance, can become cruelty wearing a mask of virtue. Inside, patients were bound in iron chains, their arms restrained by wooden stocks. The air stank of mildew, rot and despair. Cells flooded with rainwater. Rats crept across straw beds, and through the corridors echoed a chorus of prayers, screams and laughter, the wild symphony of human minds unraveling in captivity. Treatment was theatre. To the physicians of the age, madness was not a disease of thought, but a disturbance of the body. It could be driven out, like bad blood or evil air. Bleeding was prescribed to drain the corrupted humors. Cupping, purging and blistering were used to shock the system. Patients were plunged into freezing baths, spun in chairs until they vomited, or locked in darkness for days on end. The goal was not healing, but obedience. They called it discipline, they called it order, but it was fear, institutionalized. In London's Bedlam, visitors could pay a penny to watch the inmates, the lunatics, through barred doors, laughing as they ranted and wept. It became a grotesque attraction, a morality play, where the audience could feel sane by comparison. The afflicted, stripped of their dignity, became props in the empire of reason. And yet, within these walls, something quietly shifted. Among the cruelty and superstition, a few began to notice patterns. A physician might observe that some patients worsened after punishment, but improved after calm conversation or rest. That certain mad fits faded with time. That there were types of madness, melancholia, mania, hysteria. The mind, once lumped into a single abyss, began to show its contours. These were the first glimmers of psychiatry, born not from enlightenment, but from empathy glimpsed in the dark. Still, the world outside the asylum was no kinder. Madness was feared as contagion, moral or spiritual. To be declared insane was to lose one's rights, one's name, one's freedom. Families hid their afflicted relatives, locked them in attics or cellars, whispering prayers that no one would find out. The church, for its part, remained divided. Some clerics continued to see madness as possession, and exorcised the afflicted through ritual, chanting over them, sprinkling holy water, or binding them to altars as the devil's grip was driven out. Others adopted the language of medicine, yet not its mercy, replacing demons with diagnoses, but keeping the same chains. Madness had moved from the chapel to the clinic, but it was still a matter of control. In Italy, the physician Girolamo Cardano wrote that dreams, emotions, and imagination could affect the body's balance, an early hint of psychology. But few listened. His ideas blurred too dangerously with heresy. Elsewhere, Paracelsus, the Swiss physician and alchemist, declared that madness comes not from spirits but from the passions of man himself. He spoke of the mind as a natural organ, its illnesses as human, not divine. Yet his ideas were dismissed as arrogance, a mortal presuming to dissect the soul. And so, the chain remained unbroken. In France, the mad were herded into vast general hospitals alongside criminals, beggars, and vagrants. They became part of a social order, categorized, numbered, forgotten. Society's unwanted swept beneath the moral carpet. The Enlightenment was dawning, yet for the insane, the world had never been darker. Visitors described asylums as living tombs, bodies shackled to walls, faces unwashed, eyes vacant. The cries that rose from these places were not of madness. They were of abandonment. But even amid that horror, a seed of revolution began to germinate. Some thinkers, like Thomas Willis, began studying the nervous system with unprecedented precision. He dissected the human brain not for mysticism, but for knowledge, charting its folds, mapping its pathways. He argued that mental illness had a physical origin, rooted in the animal spirits of the brain. It was a small step, but a seismic one. At last, madness was being moved from the realm of sin to that of science. Yet society was slow to follow. For every mind liberated by discovery, another was imprisoned by custom. Hospitals swelled with forgotten souls, their humanity stripped in the name of progress. Europe prided itself on its reason, but reason had become its new religion, and like all religions, it demanded its sacrifices. The mad were its offering. Still, not all was lost. In the whispers of reformers, in the notebooks of physicians who cared too much, the old cruelty began to falter. A question emerged, one more dangerous than any before. If madness could be cured, could it also be understood? To answer that, society would need to look inward, to see in the eyes of the mad not monsters but mirrors. And that was a gaze few could bear. The world was on the cusp of revelation, and yet it trembled. The old walls of superstition were cracking, but behind them waited something more unsettling. Compassion, because to truly understand madness was not to fear it, but to recognize it as our own reflection. And recognition in an age still ruled by pride and power was the greatest danger of all. The next chapter would bring that danger to life. It would whisper of men who dared to open not just bodies but hearts, who replaced chains with words and cruelty with care, but such mercy would come at a cost. Morning came slowly to the long night of fear. The 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called Age of Reason, promised to awaken the world. But for those who had lived chained in darkness, the dawn was blinding. The Enlightenment spoke of liberty, of rational thought, of progress, yet its greatest challenge was not the heavens or the earth, it was the mind itself. For if man was to be free, he first had to understand what it meant to think, to feel, to suffer. The physicians and philosophers of the New Age began to look upon the insane not as sinners or spectacles, but as puzzles. They saw in madness a reflection of humanity's hidden depths, the ungoverned chaos beneath civilization's polished surface. And slowly, dangerously, they began to believe that compassion might heal what cruelty had worsened. Across Europe, a quiet rebellion unfolded, not with swords, but with sympathy. In France during the late 18th century, a physician named Philip Pinel walked into the Bicêtre asylum. There, hundreds of men, naked, filthy and chained to walls, moaned in the half-light of despair. For centuries, their cries had been drowned by prayer and protocol, but Pinel, trembling and resolute, did something unthinkable. He ordered the chains struck off. One by one the iron fetters fell, clattering to the stone floor, like the echo of centuries breaking. Witnesses called him mad himself. The guards protested. The inmates would riot. They warned. They would kill him, but they did not. The freed men wept. Some knelt. Others reached out as if sunlight itself were a miracle. Pinel believed what the Middle Ages could not, that the mad were not beasts, but human beings trapped in invisible prisons. He introduced what he called moral treatment, an idea radical in its simplicity, that kindness, conversation and dignity could restore reason where pain had failed. It was a revolution. In England, William Tuke, a Quaker philanthropist, founded the York Retreat, a serene home surrounded by gardens, where patients were treated with respect and gentle labor instead of violence. Here, for the first time, the mad were invited to walk in sunlight, to work, to talk, to live. The results astonished Europe. Those once thought lost began to recover, and with their recovery came something far more dangerous than madness: hope. The walls of Bedlam began to tremble, but change was slow, and cruelty stubborn. In many corners of Europe, asylums remained dungeons. Doctors debated whether Pinel's mercy was science or sentimentality. Was madness a moral failure, a weakness of will, or a sickness that could touch anyone? The question haunted the age. As Enlightenment thinkers dissected the body and charted the stars, they began to turn their gaze inward. Philosophers like Descartes and Locke argued over the nature of thought itself. The mind, once a battlefield between angels and demons, became an engine of ideas, capable of error, of invention, of delusion. Humanity was beginning to see itself, not as a vessel of divine mystery, but as the author of its own dreams and nightmares. Science, too, turned its eye to the brain. Microscopes revealed the shimmering networks of nerves, delicate threads that carried sensation, will, and emotion. In these pale strands of tissue, physicians saw something holy, the machinery of consciousness. And yet, for all this progress, darkness lingered at the edges of the light. Reason brought freedom, but it also brought control. As medicine advanced, madness became a matter of classification. Doctors began to label the mind with cold precision. Mania, melancholia, hysteria, dementia. Each word a cage, each diagnosis, a key that could both open and imprison. Patients were examined, measured, and recorded. What had once been punished as sin was now studied as symptom. The human soul became data, and with this new science came a subtle cruelty, the kind that smiles as it confines. Even those who sought to heal carried the arrogance of certainty. They believed they had conquered mystery, that reason could cure all wounds, but the mind, ever elusive, refused to be tamed. For every success story, there were countless forgotten, those who slipped between the definitions, whose pain could not be named. In the new age of progress, madness still wore chains, only now they were invisible. By the early 19th century, as industrialization roared through Europe, the asylums swelled again. The poor, the outcast, the rebellious, all were gathered beneath the same roof as the insane. Society, obsessed with order, found comfort in confinement. It was safer to label dissent as madness than to confront what it revealed about the world itself. And so the cycle continued. Enlightenment had promised understanding, but it had also birthed bureaucracy. The mad were studied, but not always seen, cared for, but not always understood. Still, something irreversible had begun. The veil of superstition had been torn. The human mind could no longer be treated as divine property. It belonged to humanity now, a realm of endless complexity, of beauty and terror intertwined. Poets and artists began to see in madness, not disease, but metaphor. Shakespeare had once written of the lunatic, the lover and the poet, as kindred souls. Now that kinship deepened, pain became expression. The asylum walls began to whisper art, poetry, philosophy. The mind's torment, once silenced, began to speak back. The age of reason had done what faith never could. It made madness visible, but visibility is not acceptance. Even as science advanced, stigma endured. People feared what they saw, not devils this time, but themselves. Because to study the human mind was to discover its mirror, frailty, illusion, contradiction. And in that reflection, the Enlightenment saw its own madness, its obsession with order, its worship of control. The revolution that began with broken chains would lead in time to something even greater, a new kind of doctor, a new kind of patient, and a new definition of what it means to be human. But before that dawn, a storm would rise. Science would turn inward, deeper than ever before, into the folds of thought, the abyss of the unconscious, the depths where reason cannot breathe. There, in the century to come, the old fears would return, not cloaked in superstition, but in the language of medicine itself, because when you peer too closely into the human mind, you do not always find order. Sometimes, you find the echo of the Middle Ages whispering back. Beware what you awaken. And so, as the age of reason gave way to the age of psychology, the world stood on the edge once more, between knowledge and madness, science and soul, light and shadow. The story was not over. It was only descending deeper. The mind had been freed. Now it would be explored, and in that exploration lay both salvation and the seeds of a new kind of fear. From the echoing monasteries of the Middle Ages to the bright halls of the Enlightenment, the story of madness is the story of humanity's fear of itself. For centuries, the mind was a battlefield of sin and salvation, chained by superstition, punished by ignorance, and silenced by faith. When medicine dared to look within, it found not demons but complexity, a landscape of pain, imagination, and fragile brilliance. From exorcisms to asylums, from cruelty to compassion, each age redefined madness in its own image. And though reason finally cast its light, it revealed a truth older than any doctrine, that to understand the mind is to confront what we fear most, our own reflection. The journey from darkness to understanding is not yet complete. It is a mirror we still walk toward, uncertain whether we seek healing or revelation. If this journey through the shadows of history moved you, if it made you see madness not as horror but as humanity, then join us in uncovering more forgotten truths. Like this video, if you believe knowledge should never be chained. Subscribe to our channel to follow the next story, where myth and reason, faith and fear collide in the human heart. Each episode is a step deeper into the soul of history, where kings went mad, saints saw visions, and the thin line between genius and insanity still flickers in the dark. Comment below and tell us, which story of the mind's struggle should we explore next? Would you like to journey into the life of those who tried to heal it, or those who were destroyed by it? Your voice shapes the next descent, because every age fears the mind, and every era must face it anew.